Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another Harloween video, and today we are picking up with part 2 of the Mark Kilroy case. So Mark Kilroy was a college student who disappeared in March of 1989 while on a spring break trip to Matamoros, Mexico. He was last seen near a bar and his disappearance prompted a massive search effort. Now that's kind of where we left off, introducing who Mark was, why he was in Matamoros in 1989, kind of the series of events that he and his friends went through, that whole kind of spring break trip that they were on, and also what the kind of temperature was in Mexico at that time, what was happening with the drug cartels, with the government, with law enforcement, things like that. So we touched on all of those things, and we're picking up today with part 2, and we're going to find out the rest about what happened. So on April 9th, the police returned to the Santa Elena ranch, this time ready to take action, and they arrested key figures in the Hernandez cartel. They arrested Serafin Hernandez, his uncle Elio, and 2 other gang members who were there at the time, at the ranch at the time, David Serna Valdez and Sergio Martinez Salinas. But what struck the officers most wasn't just who they had in custody. It was how the arrested men reacted. They didn't panic. They didn't flinch. In fact, they seemed almost amused. What do they call it? Unbothered? They were unbothered. With an unsettling confidence, considering the situation they were in, these men told the police that they weren't worried. They couldn't be held. Why? Because they were protected by a power beyond any man's law. And they were talking about Santa Muerte, the saint of death. In the shack where the horrible discoveries had been made, a skeletal figure clad in robes had been found amongst the other items. And Santa Muerte's role and relevance in Mexican culture demands a side quest to truly understand how deep this all went, especially for the cartels. From the book Blood and Death by John Lee Brooke, quote, "To the people of Mexico, Santa Muerte is not the personification of a dead person. Rather, she is the actual embodiment of death. She conveys her adherence to the afterlife, and her gender, as indicated by the feminine Santa, is distinctly female. In iconic form, which is skeletal and bald, Santa Muerte is devoid of sexuality. Female attire is added along with wigs. Her ability to work miracles surpasses even that of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. For this reason, she is known as La Dama Ponderosa, the powerful lady, offering protection to those who worship her. Santa Muerte's followers include criminals, especially drug traffickers. According to one expert, Father David Romeo, over 5 million Mexicans adore and admire her. In reality, the numbers are probably much higher. Santa Muerte is the patroness of the majority of prisoners in Mexican, Texan, and Californian prisons who offer her sacrifices of cocaine, marijuana, cigarettes, and blood. Unlike other saints, her reputation is that she takes care of business. Santa Muerte is dynamic. She does not simply make vague promises, she delivers." End quote. In Mexico City alone, there are 10 shrines and 120 altars dedicated to Santa Muerte. So where did this figure come from? Some say she is an evolution of the Aztec goddess of death who reigned over the underworld. However, the first mention of her name is seen in a 1797 document from the Spanish Inquisition. In this document, we discover that the Chichimeque Indians of Guanajuato worshipped Santa Muerte, and apparently the way that they worshipped her and the way that they it's funny because it says they worshipped her, but then they go on to detail how the Chichimeque people actually got Santa Muerte to do their bidding. And they did this by binding her with ropes and threatening to torture her if she did not perform miracles for them. So I guess that's what they considered to be worshiping her. I don't know. It feels a little toxic to me. Of course, the Catholic Church made sure that once they were aware of Santa Muerte and what she stood for and the fact that, she wasn't a part of Christianity, they stamped her out. Her followers were threatened into silence, and they went underground. So the next time we know of Santa Muerte being mentioned is in the 1940s, when researchers found evidence of love magic being performed with the saint. And this was a magic that was especially popular amongst women who believed that their men were being unfaithful. So the cult of Santa Muerte began in Mexico in the mid-20th century, but stayed underground until the 1990s. By the late 2000s, Santa Muerte had become Mexico's second most popular saint after St. Jude, and by 2005, the cult was brought to the United States by Mexican and Central American immigrants. By 2012, there were tens of thousands of followers throughout the country, primarily in cities with large Hispanic and Latino communities. And as of 2016, the cult of Santa Muerte was considered to be one of the fastest-growing new religious movements, not just in Mexico, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. The most zealous and passionate followers of Santa Muerte, however, are the drug cartels, who build ornate altars to her using gems and gold. In 2008, the heads of 11 decapitated bodies were discovered in the Yucatan Peninsula, and in the home of the two men arrested in connection with the slayings, law enforcement discovered an altar to none other than Santa Muerte. An altar to the saint was also discovered in New Jersey when police entered a brothel that was being used as an illegal drug den, as well as images of the saint being found in Wisconsin guarding the stash of a drug dealer. In 2021, 8 people were arrested in a Mexican border town for killing 2 10-year-old boys and a 55-year-old woman during ritual sacrifices to Santa Muerte. According to the Mexican government, they routinely destroy public and roadside shrines to the saint, and in 2009 alone, they took out 30 of these shrines. The cartels are drawn to Santa Muerte because she is said to grant wishes in return for pledges or offerings. And according to Tony Kail, author of Magical Religious Groups and Ritualistic Activities, quote, Mexican drug traffickers have embraced the narco culture in a similar manner to which American street gangs like the Blood and Crips historically embraced gangster rap music and culture. Santa Muerte is embraced as a literal angel of death that can comfort those on the fringes of society who might otherwise lack the spiritual courage to commit acts of crime or violence, end quote. So we did talk a little bit about Santa Muerte. There's books written about this, multiple books written about this. I will actually put them in the description box because specifically I alone read 2 books that were dedicated to this topic, Santa Muerte and Mexico and the drug cartels. It's very interesting. There's a lot of context to it that, once again, I can't really get into right now, but if you're interested in learning more, I definitely suggest you check these books out. I got them on Kindle. I think there's Audible versions too. You can buy the hard copy book if you still have an attention span left in 2024. But they're great. So while Seraphin, Elio, and the others sat behind bars, detectives turned their attention to a caretaker from the ranch. We mentioned him briefly last time, and that was 29-year-old Domingo Reyes Bustamante. So the federales questioned Bustamante about the drug activities, but there was one thing that they needed to know more than anything else. What did he know about Mark Kilroy? And so they showed him a picture of Mark, and when he saw the picture, the caretaker confirmed everyone's worst fears. Mark had been there. He pointed to the shack, the same shack where the terrifying black magic items had been found, and Bustamante, or Reyes, depending on how you want to refer to him. It's Domingo Reyes Bustamante. But anyways, Reyes said that he had cooked Mark a meal of eggs. And they were like, well, when did this happen? And he said about 3 to 4 weeks prior, which would line up with how long Mark had been missing. Now, in that moment, the police knew something horrific had happened to Mark. Obviously, you couldn't be on that ranch with that shack and then be missing. And the last people you were known to be with were drug cartels and, you know, people like the Hernandez cartel. You couldn't be okay after that. I think there was a part in one of the books I read where one of the police officers was like, well, he had breakfast, so maybe he was just a guest there. And I was like, dude, I mean, I'm glad that your work has not jaded you yet, but come on. So Commander Juan Benitez asked Reyes, well, why was Mark Kilroy there? at the ranch. And Reyes shrugged and responded, quote, "I don't know. I was told to feed him, and then I was told to go tend to my goats. He was gone when I got back," end quote. So the American authorities were immediately notified, and they rushed to Matamoros to help with the investigation. Back at the police station, the interrogation of Seraphin and the others dragged on, and they kind of felt that Seraphin was going to be the easiest to crack. And at the end, he was, but they were still surprised because of the fact that he was just some college student, in Texas, and he wasn't, I guess, a full-time drug cartel member, and he kind of had this round baby face. They were like, he's going to crack soon, a few hours. That's it. It took him 2 days to actually start talking, which they were very surprised about. So finally, Seraphin Hernandez broke, and what he revealed was more horrifying than the investigators could ever imagined. Over the past 9 months, the Hernandez gang had kidnapped and ritually sacrificed 13 men, believing that these human sacrifices would make them invincible and protect their drug trade from law enforcement rivals and even bullets. He explained that these rituals weren't just random acts of violence. They were part of their religion, their voodoo, and the man orchestrating it all was their El Padrino, or godfather. Who was this godfather? Well, it was Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, a 26-year-old Cuban man who practiced Santeria and Palo Mayombe. Seraphin Hernandez told the police, quote, "It was our religion, our voodoo. We did it for success. We did it for protection. He told us killing would bring us power. He told us our souls were dead. Adolfo is very powerful, very smart. He runs our business in Matamoros. He has connections all over Mexico. Movie stars go to him. Congressmen." End quote. Now, was this an exaggeration that Adolfo is so powerful and he's got clients of movie stars and congressmen and people in high positions of power? I guess we're going to see. But the question we want to look at now is, how did the Hernandez cartel transform from a gang, a drug cartel, into a cult willing to sacrifice human lives? Which I guess they didn't really transform, right? They could be both things at once. But to understand that, we have to go back to when Elio Hernandez took over the gang after his brother's assassination. Remember that Saul Hernandez was shot to death outside of a nightclub by some rival gang members, and this event, it scared Elio. It kind of showed him even the strongest of us can be taken out, and it left him desperate for protection, a protection that went beyond guns or hired muscle or even paying off law enforcement for protection. Elio wanted something more, something that could shield them from their enemies and the law, even if they didn't know who those enemies were. And in the dangerous world they operated in, the whispers on the streets all pointed to one name, and that was Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, a black magic practitioner said to be the best there was. Now, Elio believed that Constanzo's magic would be the ultimate weapon to safeguard the Hernandez cartel. Let's talk a little bit about who Constanzo was, because this is an incredibly interesting backstory. Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was born in Miami on November 1st, 1962, to a 15-year-old Cuban immigrant named Delia Aurora Gonzalez del Val. So he was the first of her 3 children, each with a different father, and it kind of seemed like she never really knew who his father was. But from an early age, Constanzo was drawn into his mother's and his grandmother's spiritual practices, and he immersed himself in the world of Santeria and Palo Mayombe. These were 2 belief systems or 2 religions that would eventually shape who he would become as a person. Santeria has deep roots in Cuban history, emerging from a blend of Western African Yoruba religion and Iberian Catholicism. The Yoruba people, originating from modern-day Nigeria and Benin, were forcibly brought to the Caribbean as slaves. Forbidden from practicing their native religion, they were forced to adopt Catholicism. But instead of abandoning their beliefs, the African slaves adapted. They found ways to merge their traditions with Catholic practices, cleverly disguising their rituals. And this was how Santeria was born, using Catholic saints as stand-ins for their own orishas, or spiritual messengers of their faith. To outsiders, it looked like they were praying to the Catholic saints, but in reality, they were preserving a rich and sacred heritage, one they were not willing to let go of, even at the risk of bodily harm or death. Over time, as slavery ended and Cuban society evolved, so did Santeria. It blended even further with Spanish culture and other Caribbean traditions, becoming the religion we see today. There are no churches, no centralized authority, just private homes and informal societies where altars are set up to honor the Orishas. And it's not a religion you'll find written down in any book. Its teachings are passed down, orally, from priest to initiate. It's very sacred. It keeps the tradition alive, but also deeply personal. Central to Santeria is the belief in one supreme god, Olodumare, also known as Oloran. Olodumare is considered the ultimate source of, basically it's called Ake, I believe. It's the spiritual energy that flows through the universe and flows through every living thing. It's spelled A-C-H-E, but I don't believe it's pronounced Ake, and I couldn't figure out how it was pronounced. If you guys know how it's pronounced, let me know in the comments, but I think it's Ake, if I understand right. I watched a couple videos and it was pronounced differently. I guess I have to have it orally passed down to me so that I can really know the way it's pronounced, because all the 3 videos I watched, nobody pronounced it the same. But anyways, this Ake, or this energy, can be harnessed through rituals, making Olodumare a powerful presence in the lives of Santeria practitioners. To interact with the world, Olodumare works through messengers, who are known as Orishas. Each Orisha governs a different aspect of life, acting as guardians, protectors, and guides. Because they represent various facets of existence, followers choose which Orisha to pray to based on their needs or their desires. Practitioners honor the Orishas at altars, either at home or in the temple, basically. It's a house or a temple run by a santerio, which is a priest, or a santeria, which is a priestess. Communication with the Orishas happens through prayer, divination, and offerings. And these offerings can be simple, like candy, candles, liquor, flowers, or fruit, or more significant, such as sacrifices. Now, sacrifice is a crucial aspect of Santeria, seen as essential for maintaining balance and well-being. It's believed that through sacrifice, practitioners can restore harmony and gain blessings like health, prosperity, and protection from the Orishas and their ancestors. Now, the word sacrifice, especially considering the kind of video we're doing right now, that might conjure up images of blood and violence. But with Santeria, that's not always the case. Most offerings are everyday items, your candies, your flowers, your liquor. Animal sacrifice is reserved for more serious situations like death, sickness, or misfortune. And when an animal is sacrificed, allegedly it's done with great respect. They make sure it's as quick and painless as possible. In many cases, the meat is shared and eaten by those involved in the ritual. But if it's a ritual cleansing, the belief is that the animal absorbs the person's negative energies and problems. And in those cases, obviously, the carcass would not be consumed. It would be disposed of, because you don't want to reabsorb the negative energy you just transferred, right? It's obvious. It makes sense to me. So Santeria and Palo Mayombe, they share many similarities, and it's not uncommon for practitioners of one to follow both religions. But here's the key difference. While Santeria avoids the use of human remains, Palo Mayombe doesn't shy away from it. Palo Mayombe traces its roots back to the Congo region of Africa, and it was developed in Cuba among enslaved Africans as part of a larger tradition known as Regla da Palo. So over time, it did become associated with witchcraft in Latin America, mainly because of its use of human bones and its intense, important focus on communicating with the dead. So this reputation has given Palo Mayombe a darker, more fearsome slant compared to other branches of Regla de Palo. At the heart of Palo Mayombe is the Nganga, a powerful cauldron that serves as a vessel for a spirit called the Mfumbi. This spirit is believed to possess immense power, acting as a guide, ally, or even a servant to the practitioner. But the Nganga isn't just a container, it's considered a living entity that requires care and attention from its practitioner, known as Paleros for men or Polaris for women. The Nganga is filled with a variety of items representing different different elements of nature and power, creating a miniature universe where the spirit resides. So inside the cauldron, you might find sticks, herbs, stones, soil, insects, and animal remains. But the most powerful components that can be put in these cauldrons are the human bones. And these bones are often taken from graveyards under the cover of night or passed down through generations, which is kind of cool, actually, if you think about it. Like, as long as you didn't kill anybody to get the bones, and it's like a family heirloom, that's kind of cool. I like that. I don't know why. It's kind of dark, but it's kind of interesting to me. So alongside the human bones, other objects like gemstones, coins, razor blades, knives, padlocks, horseshoes, railway spikes, wax, liquor, and wine are carefully chosen to amplify the Nganga's power, transforming it into basically a conduit for energy. For practitioners of Palomayambe, maintaining the Nganga's power relies on ritual offerings to feed the spirit and keep it strong. Animal sacrifices, rum, cigars, and blood are common, and without these offerings, the spirit weakens. So you have to feed it, like a pet that you want to keep alive. And if that happens, if you're not feeding it, if the Nganga loses its power, this leaves the practitioner very vulnerable. So like I mentioned earlier, human bones play a crucial role. They serve as a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. They're thought to carry immense energy, especially if they belonged to someone who died violently or unexpectedly, which makes the spirit more willing to assist in achieving the practitioner's goals. The Nfumbi draws on this energy, transforming the Nganga into a tool capable of influencing events, offering protection, or even causing harm. Now, while Palomayambe does involve the use of human remains, these bones are usually, like I said, taken from graveyards or passed down through generations, not achieved through acts of human sacrifice. But some individuals, like Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, well, they gotta be extra. They always have to take things too far. And so somebody like that, like Constanzo, would disregard the traditional rules entirely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So when Constanzo was just 6 months old, his mother, Delia, brought him to a Palomayambe priest who told her that her infant son was a chosen one, destined for great power. Now, this revelation ignited something in Delia, and she had Constanzo blessed by the priest. Soon after that, Delia moved with her young son to San Juan, Puerto Rico, because remember, he was born in Miami, so this happened in Miami. Then she moves to San Juan, and there she immersed herself even deeper into Palomayambe. Determined to raise her son, Constanzo, within this world of magic and ritual, Delia made sure his upbringing was guided by multiple practitioners. And of course, since that's the way he was raised, that's what he was surrounded with, that's how he was programmed in childhood, it wasn't long before Constanzo began his own journey into this mystical realm, absorbing its teachings and rituals. By 1972, the family returned to Miami for good, and Constanzo, now older, started a full-time apprenticeship with a priest who would lead him further into the practices of Palomayambe. While Delia didn't flaunt her religious practices publicly, it wasn't easy to keep them entirely hidden, especially in 1970s Miami. So neighbors began whispering, sensing that something was off, and rumors spread that Delia was a witch. And those who crossed her often found themselves on the receiving end of eerie warnings. So one woman named Elena discovered a dead goose on her doorstep, its head wrapped in a red handkerchief. Another woman, Carmen, found a decapitated chicken at her door shortly after her son had a dispute with Delia. So when I say crossed Delia, I don't mean come in contact with her, like they're walking down the street and they cross paths. I mean crossed her, did her dirty, or at least she thought that they were doing her dirty. So it was as if Delia's silent threats spoke louder than any words ever could, especially because people already thought she was a witch. And inside her home, Delia kept an altar where she performed her rituals. She and her children moved frequently, leaving a string of rented homes in Miami vandalized and stained with blood, and also the remnants of Palomayambe's rituals and practices. On one occasion, police arrested Delia after finding her in a tiny, filthy apartment crammed with several children and nearly 30 animals. The floor was soaked in blood, urine, and feces. She was charged with child neglect, but this would not be her last encounter with the law. Over the years, Delia faced numerous arrests for charges ranging from trespassing to check fraud to grand theft, but somehow the charges never seemed to stick. You can thank Santa Muerte for that. I'm just kidding, but kind of not really, because she genuinely thought that. She genuinely thought that because of the Palo Mayombe and because of her sacrifices and what she was doing, that's why she never got into trouble, even though she was doing bad things. Each time, Delia walked away with nothing more than probation, and she attributed her ability to evade the law to the power of her religions. As her son, Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, grew older, he fully embraced the teachings of his Palo Mayombe apprenticeship. Together with his mentor, he engaged in grave robbing to supply the priests in Ganga. This wasn't just a passing interest for Constanzo, though. It was now his way of life, basically all he knew. And according to his mother Delia, by the time Constanzo turned 14 in 1976, he began to exhibit what she claimed were psychic abilities. What I say is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Some dude told you that your son was going to be, this huge, powerful figure in these religions when he was 6 months old, and you've been trying to make that the truth and the case his entire life. So what do I know, though? So Delia said that Adolfo could allegedly predict future events with uncanny accuracy, further convincing her that her son was destined for something far greater or something far darker, depending on how you look at it, depending on which side you sit. By early 1983, Constanzo had chosen his patron saint. And I'm going to try to say the name of this patron saint, but I know I'm not going to say it right. I can't really figure out how to pronounce it, but it's, I believe, Kadimpembe. This is Palo Mayombe's devil. So with the blessing of his priest, Constanzo fully devoted himself to the worship of evil, embracing a path that promised power and profit. His initiation into this darker world wasn't just symbolic. It was etched into his very skin because as part of the final ritual, Constanzo's mentor took a knife and carved mystical symbols into his flesh, leaving scars that would forever mark him as a devotee of this malevolent force. That same year, Constanzo, just 21 years old, did something that was a little weird after pledging yourself to the devil. He took a modeling job in Mexico City. I mean, maybe that's not weird. I don't know. It just felt kind of weird to me at first, but then I said it and I'm like, yeah, a lot of people think the people that go into Hollywood and who become rich and powerful and famous sell their soul to the devil, so it kind of makes sense. But actually, Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was perfect for a modeling job. He had striking looks, a handsome face, he had a good build, long dark hair. He was undeniably captivating. There's something about him. He drew people in with both his appearance and his charisma, and it wasn't long before Constanzo began using this magnetic charm to his advantage. In Mexico City, he spent his free time telling fortunes with tarot cards in the city's infamous Zona Rosa, a bustling district known for its nightlife and its population of sex workers. And it was here, in the midst of the chaos and intrigue of the city, that he began to gather his first disciples: Martin Quintana Rodriguez, Jorge Montes, and Omar Oria Ocheo, a young journalism student with a deep obsession for the occult. They were among the first to be drawn into his orbit. By mid-1984, Constanzo decided to make Mexico City his permanent home, seeking what his mother called new horizons. Moms always just think the best of you, don't they? So he moved in with Martin and Omar. They lived together in a sort of throuple arrangement, and at the same time, he was expanding his circle of followers as his reputation for magic began to spread across the city. Constanzo's services quickly became in high demand. He offered tarot card readings and something called limpias, which are ritual cleansings for those who believed they were cursed by their enemies. For many, a limpia is more than just a ritual. It's a way to cleanse their body, mind, and soul of negative energies and attract happiness, love, health, and prosperity, which sounds great. And there's countless ways to perform this. Constanzo knew how to do them all. In one method, he would pass an egg over the client's body, sometimes using fragrant water or the leaves of a plant as well. The egg was then cracked into a glass of water, and the patterns revealed were believed to represent the evil absorbed from the client's body. Now, these were the traditional practices that Constanzo offered to the desperate and the fearful, but not all of Constanzo's clients were seeking spiritual cleansing. As his reputation grew, so did the wealth and the power of his clientele. Wealthy drug dealers turned to him, not just for readings, but for guidance on how to run their operations. And for the right price, Constanzo would use his abilities to help them schedule shipments and meetings, ensuring their success. He even promised magic that could make gangsters and their bodyguards invisible to the police or bulletproof against their enemies. According to Constanzo's ledgers, one drug dealer in Mexico City paid him a staggering $40,000 for these services over just 3 years. In a world where life and death often hung in the balance, Constanzo's magic became a commodity, a twisted insurance policy for those who could afford it. Constanzo's influence spread far and wide, reaching some of the most powerful people in Mexico. His following wasn't just made up of the young and impressionable or the leaders of drug cartels. It included high-ranking law enforcement officers and people you would literally never expect to fall under his spell. People like members of the Federal Judicial Police in Mexico City. At least 4 police officers joined his cult, including a commander responsible for narcotics investigations. One of them even went on to lead the Mexican branch of Interpol after retiring from the federales. So, how does that make you feel? Not super comfy. By the middle of 1985, Constanzo's influence was firmly established. It was around that time that he and 3 of his disciples took a significant step to solidify his power, raiding a Mexico City graveyard to collect human bones, and they started creating their own nganga. And with each bone and sacred object, Constanzo's power grew stronger, and so did his hold over those who followed him. In early 1986, Constanzo's reach expanded even further. The head of the Mexican branch of Interpol introduced him to the Calzada family, one of Mexico's most dominant cartels at the time. These were hardened drug dealers, men who trusted no one, but somehow Constanzo, with his charm and promises of magical protection, managed to win them over. Before long, he was providing his services to the Calzada cartel, using his rituals to help them navigate the cutthroat world of drug trafficking. He's kind of like a fixer, I guess, right? Like, even if he didn't have actual magical powers, now that I'm thinking about it, if he just had connections, like the right connections and a basic know-how, he could make it look like he had magical powers and he could actually benefit these cartels, which is interesting. That's interesting to think about. But as the cartel's success continued, their belief in Constanzo's magic only deepened. He was kind of like a Rasputin figure, a Rasputin figure to the Romanov family. That's what Constanzo was to these cartels. And I just put that together in my mind. It's very interesting. So these cartels, because they truly believed he was magical, they kept returning to him, convinced that his power was the secret to their very survival. The money from these services obviously began pouring in because these cartels have money. And at this point, they have so much money. They literally don't know what to do with it. They need protection. They need to keep growing their empire. They need that more than they need this temporary money. So they're going to start throwing it at this dude. And by early 1987, Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was living like a king. He paid cash for a condo in Mexico City, and he treated himself to a fleet of luxury cars, including an $80,000 Mercedes-Benz. But wealth and power weren't enough for Constanzo. When he wasn't working his magic for the Calzadas or his other high-paying, high-profile clients, Constanzo was orchestrating scams of his own. In one instance, he posed as a DEA agent to swindle a cocaine dealer. Then he turned around and sold the stolen stash through his police contacts for $100,000. And with every successful scheme, his confidence grew. He believed in his own magic. He believed that his black magic made him invincible, untouchable, and capable of anything, which really lets you know that a lot of these people, these scam artists or whatever, these messiahs, these cult leaders, these figures throughout history, like Charles Manson and David Koresh, and we have a million more to talk about, but maybe they genuinely believed they were like the chosen one. Maybe they genuinely believed they were special and magical and had powers. And it wasn't just that they were manipulating other people to believe it. It was like a folie à deux, like a shared delusion amongst the whole group. But for Constanzo, there was always a need to push further, to go bigger. To keep the cartels interested, he had to escalate. That's when he began offering something even more extreme: human sacrifice. It's unclear just how many victims Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo tortured and killed, but a chilling number of unsolved mutilation murders occurred around Mexico City during his time there. His willingness to inflict pain, to kill complete strangers, or even those close to him, it only cemented his reputation among the ruthless drug dealers who became his most loyal clients. They weren't just impressed by his rituals. They were in awe of his ferocity, I guess, his depravity, his willingness to do whatever it took to maintain power and control. In their eyes, Constanzo wasn't just a man. He was a god. He was a force of nature, someone who could deliver the protection and success they craved, no matter the cost, to them or to himself. Now, by the end of his first year with the Calzada cartel, Constanzo was riding high on his perceived success. I mean, I guess it wasn't perceived success. He was successful financially, but his perceived success, like his success rate in keeping these cartels safe and in basically manifesting things to come true. He had convinced himself that it was his magical powers alone that ensured the Calzada family's continued survival and prosperity. They believed that as well. And in April 1987, emboldened by his sense of invincibility, he demanded a full partnership in the syndicate. But surprisingly, actually, the Calzadas refused his demand. And although Constanzo appeared to take the rejection in stride, he was unbothered, it soon became clear he was pissed. He was boiling beneath the surface. How dare they look a gift horse in the mouth? So on April 30th, 1987, Guillermo Calzada Sanchez and 6 members of his household mysteriously vanished. When they were reported missing the next day, police discovered melted candles and other signs of a religious ceremony at Calzada's office. 6 days later, officers began pulling mutilated remains from the Zampango River. Over the course of a week, 7 bodies were recovered, each bearing the unmistakable marks of sadistic torture. Fingers, toes, and ears had been removed, hearts and genitals cut out or cut off. One body had part of its spine torn out, while 2 others were found with their brains missing. The police had no way of knowing this, but we know it, right? We can put 2 and 2 together. Those missing body parts had been used to feed Constanzo's Nganga, strengthening his power for even greater conquests. By July 1987, Constanzo had set his sights on his next source of power and wealth: the Hernandez cartel, and he knew exactly how to reach them. His plan began with a young woman named Sara Aldrete, who was dating a guy named Gilberto Sosa, a drug dealer for the Hernandez cartel. Adolfo decided to use his charm and good looks to draw Sara into his world, long before the Hernandez gang even realized what was happening. And Sara had no idea that this encounter was not only planned and intentional, but that it would pull her into a world of darkness and danger. Now, I would argue she was dating a drug dealer already. She was already dating a cartel member. It's kind of like she was already sort of there in a world of darkness and danger, but whatever. So Sara Maria Aldrete Villarreal was born on September 6th, 1964 in Matamoros, Mexico. And from an early age, she stood out. And part of the reason that she stood out was because she had this striking beauty, but also because of her height. She was standing at an impressive 6'1". She had a presence that simply couldn't be ignored. Beauty, she's tall, she's smart too, right? Because Sara attended Porter High School in Brownsville, Texas, where she quickly earned a reputation as a model student. Teachers were impressed by her dedication and her discipline, and her drive only intensified when she moved on to secretarial school. There, her instructors encouraged her to aim higher and apply apply for college. In 1985, Sarah enrolled at Texas Southmost College, a 2-year school in Brownsville, with plans to study physical education. Her goal was to eventually transfer to a 4-year school and earn her teaching certification. She started classes in January of 1986, juggling 2 part-time jobs, one as an aerobics instructor and another as an assistant secretary in the school's athletic department. Despite her demanding schedule, Sarah excelled, making the honor roll and establishing herself as a standout student. But Sarah wasn't just excelling in the classroom. Very similar to Mark Kilroy, she was very engaged in her school community. She became an integral part of the campus, organizing and leading a booster club for the soccer team and even earning the school's Outstanding Physical Education Award. By the 1987-1988 academic year, she was one of just 33 students selected from a student body of 6,500 for inclusion in the school's Who's Who directory, an honor given to those with a GPA of at least 3.0 who were actively involved in campus organizations. On the surface, Sarah had it all: a promising future, academic success, and a growing list of accomplishments. But what she didn't know was that her life was about to take a dark turn, intersecting with Constanzo's dangerous world. And that encounter would change everything. In the summer of 1987, like I said, Sarah was dating Gilberto Sosa, a drug dealer working for the Hernandez cartel. And when Constanzo looked into Sosa as a potential entry point to reach the Hernandez clan, he discovered Sarah, and he quickly devised a plan to meet her. In July, Constanzo put his plan into action. Driving his Mercedes through the streets of Matamoros, he deliberately cut Sarah off in traffic, narrowly avoiding a collision. He stepped out of the car, all smiles, apologies, and charm, and he introduced himself as Adolfo Constanzo, a Cuban-American living in Mexico City. Sarah, captivated by his charisma and good looks, felt an immediate attraction, and the two quickly became friends. Some sources suggest that Sarah hoped their relationship would become romantic, but Constanzo wasn't interested because he liked men, not women. He was gay. So he definitely kind of led her on, maybe, kind of made her think that, sex was in the cards, but it wasn't. So 2 weeks after their first encounter, Constanzo met with Sarah and her boyfriend, Gilberto Sosa, in Brownsville. But from the start, there was tension between Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo and Gilbert Sosa. So Constanzo refused to shake Sosa's hand, an action that obviously didn't go unnoticed. And just days later, Sosa received an anonymous phone call warning him that his girlfriend Sarah was seeing another man. And of course, he can't just ask her about this and believe her or get some evidence and proof. Gilberto Sosa's pissed. He's angry. He confronted Sarah. He was like, "Who are you seeing?" She was like, "No one. What are you talking about?" But he didn't believe her, and he broke up with her. Heartbroken, Sarah turned to Constanzo for comfort, having no idea that he was actually behind all of this, and she was playing right into his hands. So Constanzo told Sarah with an air of mystique that he had actually seen the breakup. He'd foreseen it in his tarot cards. And from that moment on, Constanzo began pulling Sarah deeper into his world. Gradually, he introduced her to his religions, the rituals, and the dark practices that came with it. And before long, Sarah wasn't just a follower. She had become a full-fledged cult member. And Constanzo gave her a new and coveted title, La Madrina, the godmother of his cult. Others didn't call her that. They mainly called her La Bruja, meaning the witch. I don't know if that's maybe a compliment in their religion, probably, but I don't know if I would the members of my family or my cult to be walking around calling me the witch, but that's what they called her. And Sarah wasn't just another cult member. She was literally Constanzo's second in command. And despite her involvement in Constanzo's sinister activities, Sarah lived a double life. She continued her life as a college student. And on campus, there was nothing to suggest her darker side. There was nothing to suggest that she was raiding cemeteries in the dark of night and then going to class in the morning. One professor who knew her well later said, quote, "She sat in my anthropology class all semester, an A student, always present, always friendly. I never saw her wear an emblem, an amulet, a talisman, any sign of black magic, and I'm trained to watch for such things. Never heard her ask a weird question, even when we talked about weird religions," end quote. That's an odd statement. You're trained do you think it's because he's an anthropology professor that he's trained to look for those things? Or why were you trained to look for those things? It just gave me Buffy the Vampire Slayer vibes, you know? Like, is he a part of the Watchers Council? Is he Rupert Giles? You know, if anybody knows where that reference came from, let me know in the comments. But absolutely, that's what it reminded me of. He's like, I'm trained to look for these things so I can help train the next vampire slayer. So basically, what I'm saying is no one at the school could have or would have guessed that when Sarah crossed the border back into Matamoros, she stepped into the role of a high-ranking member of Constanzo's black magic cult. It was like she left that behind when she crossed into Texas. There was no signs. And you'd think somebody who was that deep into it, who believed it that much, and who felt like their magic protected them from law enforcement and from any kind of retribution, they would flaunt their religion proudly. But maybe she was told not to. I'm not sure. But as the bond between Sarah and her godfather got stronger, Constanzo began probing Sarah's connections to the Hernandez family, skillfully weaving his influence around her. So he's playing the long game. He claimed he could see into the future and predicted that Elio Hernandez, the gang's leader, would soon come to her seeking advice for a serious problem. And just as Constanzo predicted, in November 1987, Elio Hernandez did approach Sarah looking for protection for his gang. And right on cue, Sarah introduced him to El Padrino, the godfather of black magic protection. Constanzo assured Elio that he could solve all of the gang's problems. He promised that if they faithfully followed his religious practices, they would become invisible to authorities and bulletproof in combat. But his protection came at a price, a really high price. He was ballsy for doing this. Constanzo demanded 50% of the gang's profits. 50%, and desperate for an edge in the cutthroat world of drug trafficking. Elio agreed, and just like that, Constanzo became an integral part of the Hernandez operation. Some might call him part owner of it, right? Because he's basically getting 50% of the profits. That's bananas. At first, Constanzo eased the gang in with Santeria rituals, familiarizing them with the practices. Then slowly, he introduced them to the darker and more intense rituals of Palo Mayombe. Over time, Constanzo's role expanded beyond that of a spiritual guide and cult leader. He became a drug lord himself, wielding power over the Hernandez cartel. He insisted that everyone address him as El Padrino, the godfather, and with Sarah Eldrati at his side, Constanzo began convincing the gang that animal sacrifices were the key to unlocking superhuman powers that would shield them from arrests and from bullets. Under Constanzo's guidance, Sarah fully embraced her role as La Madrina, the godmother of their rituals. Together, they led the gang through ceremonies involving cigars, rum, and the slaughter of chickens and goats. They prayed for protection from the police, from their rivals, and they prayed for money. Lots and lots of money. But Constanzo's control over the gang went far beyond mere rituals. He introduced psychological manipulation, using religious chants and ceremonies to bend his followers to his will. He also used a movie called The Believers as a tool, and this movie is about a father and a son who become involved in a world of black magic, and this reinforced his grip on his disciples and convinced them that their darker practices were the path to true power. As time passed, Constanzo escalated his demands, claiming that human sacrifices would offer even greater protection. Now, the gang, terrified of defying their godfather, agreed without question. They soon discovered the gruesome reality of what these sacrifices entailed. Victims would be kidnapped and brought to the ranch, the Santa Elena Ranch, where Constanzo would preside over the ritual. He often subjected victims to unspeakable torture, sometimes even sodomizing them before taking their lives. For Constanzo, pain and mutilation were essential. He believed the demons he served would only be pleased by a sacrifice that died in agony. He told his followers, quote, "They must die screaming." Once the victim was dead, Constanzo would remove their brain, heart, lungs, and testicles, boiling them in his nganga to create a ritual brew. This gruesome concoction was then passed among the cult members who drank it, believing it would make them invincible and bulletproof. Typically, the victims' remains were then buried in and around the corral behind the shack, leaving a chilling reminder of the cult's brutality. Once the bodies had decomposed, some of the bones were then fashioned into necklaces, which Constanzo believed would further ward off danger and injury. Most of the sacrificial victims were chosen from among the gang's enemies, rival drug dealers or corrupt cops who had crossed them. On May 28, 1988, Constanzo shot a drug dealer named Hector de la Fuente and a farmer named Moses Castillo, but this time he didn't torture or mutilate their bodies. The ritual felt incomplete, and Constanzo was left unsatisfied. Hector and Moses' bodies were buried near the ranch, but not on the property itself. And it wasn't long before a group of children stumbled upon the scene, spotting a hand sticking out of the ground. So whoever was tasked with the job of burying these bodies didn't do the best job, apparently. So the kids reported the discovery to the police, but their story was dismissed for some reason, even though it's like Mexico and there's just people going missing and showing up dead all the time. But the police were like, you kids are crazy. Go inside and play some video games. Stop exploring. You have way too much imagination. So the police didn't believe them. Nobody believed them until the horrifying truth of the ranch was uncovered later, tragically proving the children right. On July 16th, Constanzo took his brutality to even greater heights. He supervised the torture and dismemberment of Raul Paz Esquivel, a former lover of cult member Jorge Montes in Mexico City. The remains were dumped on a public street where they were discovered by children again, who ran away in terror, screaming for help as they alerted the police. Just weeks later, on August 10th, rival narcotics dealers struck the Hernandez family, kidnapping Elio's brother, Ovidio, along with his young sons, in retaliation for an $800,000 drug deal gone wrong. Determined to get Ovidio and his sons back unharmed, Constanzo's followers captured a stranger 2 days later, and they dragged him to the Santa Elena ranch, where Constanzo tortured him to death while chanting prayers for the hostage's safe release. When Ovidio and his sons were unexpectedly released on August 13th, unharmed, with no ransom paid, of course, Constanzo took full credit, claiming that his dark rituals had secured their freedom. And I mean, at this point, I'm starting to wonder if he did have powers, because that's crazy. Like, why would this other gang kidnap these people in retaliation for an $800,000 drug deal gone wrong and then just release them out of nowhere without getting any money or hurting them at all? Are we starting to believe that Constanzo has some power here? Okay, so he believed that, and obviously everyone around him felt the same way because it just was bizarre, so his reputation and influence only grew, solidifying his status as a force to be reckoned with and someone not to be messed with. Now, around this time, Constanzo elevated Elio Hernandez to the role of executioner priest, branding Elio's arms, chest, and back with a red-hot knife as part of the initiation ritual. This rite of passage granted Elio the authority to assist in executing victims, and he embraced his new role with chilling enthusiasm. It was said that he once cut out a rival's heart while the man was still alive, proving his loyalty and dedication to Constanzo's twisted beliefs. Or proving that he was just kind of like a violent and murderous man to begin with, and having this outlet and almost like permission to be just a violent dickhead kind of like unlocked him, opened him up. He was like, I can be accepted just as I am. Either way, in November, Constanzo made it clear just how unforgiving he could be. When 35-year-old ex-cop and cult member Jorge Volante de Fierro Gomez violated his strict ban on drug use, Constanzo selected him as the group's next offering. So he took one of their own and then tortured this person who was a part of their group, a part of their family, to death. And so this would be a brutal reminder to everyone else that obedience was expected and mandatory, and disobedience would not be tolerated. You're either with us or you're against us. On February 14th, 1989, 3 drug traffickers, Esquiel Rodriguez Luna, Ruben Vela Garza, and Ernesto Rivas Diaz, fell into Constanzo's trap. His men, posing as police officers, abducted the trio under the pretense of being dissatisfied with the quality of their marijuana. In reality, Constanzo's organization intended to steal their 300 kilos of marijuana. The traffickers were brought to the ranch, tortured, and ultimately shot, their lives ending in agony at the hands of the cult. 9 days later, the cult targeted another victim, an unidentified stranger. He put up such a fierce fight that Constanzo abandoned his usual rituals and ordered Elio to shoot him on the spot. The cult's thirst for blood seemed insatiable, and their hunger for violence only grew stronger. On February 25th, Constanzo commanded his followers to find a random person for their next sacrifice. They abducted 14-year-old Jose Luis Garcia Luna as he walked to his job on a nearby farm where he took care of cows. Tragically, Jose was brought back to the ranch and sacrificed. It was only later that Elio Hernandez realized, in a horrifying twist, that Jose was his own cousin. And you'd think that'd be enough for them to be like, hey guys, let's chill here, let's chill. Maybe we made kind of a hasty decision, and we need to be a little bit more careful in the future. Why don't we regroup and figure out a better way to go forward in this? But no, they didn't seem to feel that what they were doing was wrong in any way. And despite the growing number of victims, these gruesome murders went largely unnoticed by local media and authorities. The cult operated in the shadows, undetected and unchecked. That's what they were paying Constanzo to do for them, right? So it was expected that that's what would happen. But that was all about to change. By early March, Constanzo had around 800 kilos of marijuana stolen from a rival gang that he wanted to sell. He planned to smuggle it into the United States, hoping to make a fortune. But before he could proceed, he believed he needed another sacrifice to ensure maximum protection for the dangerous journey ahead. On March 13th, Constanzo staged another ritual, but he found the victim's suffering lacking. It wasn't enough, not for what he needed. So dissatisfied, he commanded his followers, quote, bring me someone I can use, someone who will scream, end quote. He said he wanted a typical gringo, an American who wasn't Hispanic or Latino. So in Constanzo's twisted mind, such an offering would grant him and his followers even greater supernatural power. In the early morning hours of March 14th, Serafin Hernandez and a few men set out in two vehicles heading toward Matamoros. They parked near the Gateway International Bridge, blending into the crowds of spring breakers, searching for the perfect target. And that's when they saw him, 21-year-old Mark Kilroy. Tall, athletic, with blonde hair and an all-American look, Mark was the epitome of the typical gringo that Constanzo had desired. He was exactly the kind of sacrifice that would make the Godfather happy. Serafin pulled up alongside Mark in a pickup truck and asked in English if he needed a ride. Maybe Mark, tired from a long night of partying, thought he'd found a friendly face. He approached the truck, completely unaware of the danger that awaited him. In a swift, violent motion, Serafin and another gang member grabbed him and threw him into the pickup truck. The ambush was quick, giving Mark very little time to react. And on top of that, he was drunk. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Just a few blocks away, Mark managed to jump out and he tried to run, adrenaline coursing through his athletic body. But the men in the second vehicle were ready. They cut off his escape, threw him in the vehicle, blindfolded him, and bound him with duct tape, his hopes of freedom slipping away. The gang drove to the ranch, winding through the shadowy back streets of Matamoros, past an industrial district. As they continued, the small bars and vendor huts faded away, giving way to endless fields stretching into the darkness. Eventually, they turned onto a narrow dirt road winding between two cornfields, the vehicle's headlights cutting through the dusty path ahead. And then in the distance, the ranch rose into view. This was where the nightmare would continue to unfold. The men left Mark tied up in the back seat of the vehicle, his heart pounding, his mind reeling with terror, and he sat there alone in the darkness, not knowing what was coming next. Hours passed in silence, his fear growing with each minute. He didn't see his captors again that night, and it wasn't until dawn that a caretaker appeared, offering him a plate of eggs, bread, and water. It was a small act of humanity in the midst of an unimaginable nightmare, but for Mark, it was just a brief pause before the horrors that lay ahead. Around 12 hours after Mark was abducted, Constanzo and his disciples came for him. They wrapped more duct tape over his eyes and mouth. They marched him across the field, his hands still tied behind his back. Blind and terrified, Mark was led into the shack, unaware of the horrors that awaited him. What followed was something straight out of your worst nightmare. Constanzo tortured and sodomized Mark, inflicting unimaginable pain for hours. In his final moments, Constanzo struck him with a machete, chopping at the back of his neck and head. Mark's body was laid out on the floor near an altar, which was covered with half-smoked cigars, bottles of alcohol, and flickering candles. But this was far from the end of the ritual. Constanzo then cut away a portion of Mark's skull and removed part of his brain, placing it in the nganga along with a turtle, chicken parts, and a goat's head. The gruesome mixture was cooked, and the cult members drank the brew, believing it would grant them the power and protection that they craved. The horror didn't stop there. To make Mark's burial easier, his legs were chopped off above the knees. A wire was then inserted into his spinal column so that once his body decomposed, the bones could be easily pulled from the soil. They wouldn't have to dig him up and sift through the dirt to find the bones. They could just pull it up, which is horrifying. And these bones would then be used to make necklaces. The cult members then dug a hole near the corral and buried Mark's body, concealing the evidence of their horrific crime, at least for now. Yet even after this gruesome act, Constanzo wasn't finished. He craved one final sacrifice before smuggling the 800 kilos of marijuana into the United States. But this time he didn't choose a random victim. He chose Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Gilberto Sosa, who was part of the Hernandez cartel. On March 28th, Gilberto was killed in yet another ritual, sacrificed to satisfy Constanzo's twisted beliefs. But Constanzo's sense of invincibility was about to be challenged because, remember, days later on April 1st, Serafin Hernandez, that fool, blew past a police roadblock, an impulsive act that would ultimately lead the authorities to the ranch. But he did this because he truly believed that he was protected and invisible from the eyes of law enforcement. Like, he drove past them and he's like, "You can't see me. You can't see me." I'm sorry. At that time, no arrests were made. So 1 week later, on April 8th, Constanzo's followers successfully delivered the drugs, the 800 kilos, and he collected a payment of $300,000, still convinced of his invincibility. But this illusion didn't last long. The very next day, on April 9th, Serafin, his uncle Elio, and 2 other drug dealers were arrested. As the net tightened around them, Constanzo, Sarah, and the other cult members managed to evade capture for now. But their time was running out, and soon the world would learn the true extent of the darkness that had taken root in Matamoros. So after confessing, Serafin Hernandez led the police to Mark's grave near the livestock corral on the Santa Elena Ranch. The grave was marked by a piece of wire protruding from the ground, just as Serafin had described. As the police carefully uncovered Mark's remains, they saw the horrifying truth. His brain had been removed. His legs had been severed above the knees, exactly as Serafin had described. The investigation then led police to the shack where they found Mark's brain in the nganga, the ritual cauldron that was used by Constanzo and his followers. But the horror didn't end there. Serafin still had to guide the police to other bodies buried on the ranch. Under the watchful eyes of the armed police force, Serafin was forced to dig up each grave himself, which, yes, thank you. One by one, the bodies emerged from the earth, all within 100 yards around the corral. So by mid-afternoon, a dozen male corpses lay side by side in a grim, silent row. 3 of the men had been buried together in a single grave, 2 in another, while the remaining 7, including Mark, had been placed in separate graves. The state of their bodies were beyond comprehension. Many of the bodies were savagely disfigured, their hearts ripped out, and their eyes, ears, and testicles removed in what can only be described as acts of unspeakable brutality. The bodies were taken to local funeral homes where they would wait to be identified through dental records due to the advanced state of decomposition, and families from across Mexico who had missing loved ones, which is quite a lot of families, they rushed to Matamoros, desperate for answers, hoping to learn if their family members had fallen victim to the cult. They gathered at the funeral homes, clinging to any hope, even as the grim reality of what had occurred became more apparent. Ultimately, investigators concluded that most of the victims were rival drug dealers who had crossed paths with Constanzo rather than random abductees like Mark. However, despite their efforts, 3 of the bodies were never identified, leaving their identities in the full extent of Constanzo's reign of terror forever shrouded in mystery. Mark's parents, James and Helen, received the devastating news that their son's remains had been found, and they sadly made their way to Brownsville. When they arrived, they faced the media, their grief palpable, but their resolve unwavering. Despite the horrors they had learned about, they expressed a sense of peace, choosing to focus on prayer for their son, and even for those accused of taking his life. Helen, with tears in her eyes, spoke to reporters about the cult that took her oldest son from her. She said, quote, "I think they must be possessed by the devil. That would be the only explanation for what they did, but we're at peace knowing Mark is safe. He's with our Lord. I will pray for them so they will realize how wrong all this is." End quote. I don't understand. Knowing what these people put your son through, how you could forgive them. And I know there's going to be people in the comments who are like, forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you. Like, still. Could never be me. Could never. So James, Mark's father, added, quote, Mark never had any involvement whatsoever in narcotics. He never even tried it. He was afraid of narcotics, but yet it was narcotics that killed Mark, end quote. I disagree with that statement. I don't think it was narcotics that killed Mark. I think it was obviously the people involved with the narcotics who got caught up in some crazy sort of belief system. But then Mark's father, James, took a moment to collect himself before continuing and saying, quote, we certainly like the idea that it's over. I'm sure we would have kept pushing hard to find Mark. I believe because Mark had such great publicity about his disappearance, we were able to find these people who did these things to Mark and that they are not doing it anymore, end quote. As he finished speaking, James looked out at the crowd, his voice steady despite the pain, and he said, quote, I don't feel any anger at all toward them. It may be hard to believe. I think their emotions are so bad. I hope someday they go up to apologize to Mark in heaven, end quote. I gotta give him credit. That's some serious strength there because, could never be me. Knowing what they did to my child? Nope. So before they ended their statements, the Kilroys announced that Mark would be laid to rest in his hometown of Santa Fe. They also shared their plans to establish the Mark Kilroy Memorial Fund, dedicated to providing scholarships for medical students, ensuring that their son's legacy would live on by helping others pursue their dreams in the field he had been so passionate about but never had a chance to go into himself. The impact of Mark's murder reverberated beyond his family, though. As news of the tragedy spread, Texas Governor Bill Clements released a statement expressing his condolences. Quote, on behalf of all Texans, I extend my sincere sympathy to Mr. and Mrs. James Kilroy and their family. This is a horrible tragedy. We are all saddened and appalled by the news, end quote. The University of Texas at Austin's president, William Cunningham, also issued a heartfelt statement. Quote, this is a tragedy for the Kilroy family and the university. Mark was an excellent student who had a great deal to offer our state and nation. The entire university community joins Mark's family in their sorrow, end quote. Within hours of the news breaking about Adolfo Constanzo's sacrificial cult and its connection to Mark Kilroy's disappearance and death, the media descended on Brownsville and Matamoros. Planes were chartered, reporters rushed to the scene, and the story of the cult killings began to spread across headlines worldwide. Now, uncovering mass murder sites wasn't exactly unheard of in Mexico, especially those tied to the drug trade. In fact, the gruesome discovery at the Santa Elena Ranch marked the third drug-related mass killing uncovered along the U.S.-Mexico border in just 3 weeks. Not 3 months, not 3 years, 3 weeks. And during that time, authorities had found 9 bodies, 3 women and 6 men, on an abandoned ranch near Agua Prieta, just across the border from Douglas, Arizona. 5 of the victims had been dumped into a well, while the other 4 were discovered in an earthen septic tank. All 9 were believed to be Mexican nationals, and their bodies bore unmistakable signs of torture. In another chilling case, 2 people from Arizona and 3 from the Mexican state of Sonora were found bound and stabbed in a shed in Tucson, Arizona. And these deaths, too, were tied to the violent world of the drug trade. It was clear that Mexico was in the grip of a surge in drug-related killings, a bloody trend that showed no signs of stopping. But the killings at the Santa Elena Ranch were different. This wasn't just another case of drug violence. It was something darker, more twisted. For the media, the idea of a drug cartel that doubled as a cult practicing human sacrifices was like something out of a horror movie, and obviously it quickly became the focal point of the story. As reporters swarmed Brownsville and Matamoros, police were ready with answers. They explained that a manhunt for the remaining cult members was in full swing, with Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo and Sarah Aldralte at the top of their list. It seemed that they had vanished into thin air, triggering a frantic search effort across the region. A police spokesperson addressed the crowd of reporters, stating, quote, the key to the whole thing is these 2 subjects, El Padrino and the lady. Hey, that's El Padrina to you, or Bruja, depending on how you feel, but put some respect on her name. He continued and said, when we have those 2, we can unravel a lot more, end quote. But it wasn't just the scale of the murders that fascinated the media. Obviously, once again, it was the chilling details. When one reporter asked how the police had managed to obtain confessions so quickly, an officer simply pointed to a bottle of water on the table. He didn't have to say a word. Everyone knew what that meant. The Mexican police were notorious for using carbonated water mixed with hot sauce to extract confessions. Do you know why they used that? So according to this 1991 article in the Los Angeles Times, a Mexican human rights group has cataloged 50 different types of torture used by police, and they say that abuses continue despite government pledges and efforts to curb them. The list of torture methods compiled include electric shock to the genitals, burning through a person's fingernails with red-hot metal clips, and forcing carbonated water laced with hot sauce or hot pepper up a suspect's nose. Okay, so you don't drink the water. It's forced up your nose, which, ouch, that would suck. I don't know if it would suck as much as electric shock to the testicles, but I don't have testicles, so I'm probably not the right person to ask. At a press conference in Matamoros, the 4 suspects who had been arrested, Serafin, his uncle, Elio, and 2 other men, were paraded before more than 100 journalists. And under the glare of TV cameras, they freely answered questions about their roles in the ritual murders, almost as if they were eager to confess. Elio, in particular, seemed to revel in the attention. He openly admitted being ordained as an executioner by Constanzo, and even took a moment to show off the satanic symbols branded on his arms, chest, and back. The camera zoomed in, capturing every mark, every scar, in unsettling detail. All 4 men confirmed that Mark Kilroy had been specifically targeted on Constanzo's orders, that Constanzo had demanded an American for the ceremony, and that he had personally executed Mark. Following the press conference, police allowed journalists onto the ranch where the atrocities had taken place. It was actually an unprecedented move. The investigation was still ongoing, yet reporters were given free rein to wander the site, touching whatever they pleased. The police even pulled the cauldrons and the machete out of the shack, leaving them outside so journalists could capture clearer photographs. And obviously it became a media circus with the horror captured in every frame. Some outlets dubbed the groups responsible for these horrors Los Narcostanicos, meaning the narco-Satanists, while others simply called them the Matamoros cult. But the spectacle didn't stop there. At one point, a truckload of officers arrived with one of their prisoners, Sergio Martinez, in tow. Armed with automatic weapons, they followed him to a spot just outside the corral fence. There, Sergio paused and pointed to the ground. An officer handed him a shovel and a pick, but not before another officer coldly stated, "You'll do it with your hands if you have to." The sun was blazing, the heat relentless, as Sergio began to dig. The humidity from a morning rain mixed with the overpowering stench of rotting hay and decomposing flesh, a smell that had hung over the ranch since the first bodies were unearthed. Cameramen wearing surgical masks and bandanas over their faces moved in closer, their lenses capturing every gruesome moment. A sound man even dangled a boom microphone over Sergio's head while reporters fired off question after question. And throughout it all, Sergio kept repeating that he hadn't killed anyone. He claimed he'd only kidnapped and buried the victims. I'm sorry, I don't feel bad for you, Sergio, okay? I don't feel bad for you. So after 45 agonizing minutes, which he definitely deserved, a knee and a part of a foot emerged from the dirt. The stench hit everyone nearby, even stronger than before. A blast of putrid wind that made them gag. One of the cameramen pulled off his surgical mask and handed it to Sergio, who took it gratefully, before crawling back into the hole to continue digging. And honestly, that was a kindness dude did not deserve. Okay, I don't care if you killed anybody. We don't know that you didn't kill anybody. You're just saying you didn't. And on top of that, you enabled it to happen. You kidnapped the people and then you buried their bodies. So now you can unbury them, bitch. Okay? You can literally unbury them now. And you don't deserve a mask. So anyways, the body that Sergio uncovered belonged to a Mexican man in his 30s. This man was blindfolded and gagged. His chest had been literally ripped open, and his heart had been gouged out, another victim of the cult's sadistic rituals. And this man marked the 13th body unearthed on that ranch, a gruesome tally that was still climbing. Just 2 days later, 2 more bodies were discovered. Drug dealer Hector de la Fuente and farmer Moses Castillo on a nearby farm, adding to the already grim count. Now, while the grisly discoveries at the ranch and surrounding areas continued, the hunt for Adolfo Constanza, Sarah Aldrate, and the remaining cult members intensified. Authorities were scrambling to piece together the fugitives' movements, and soon they learned that Constanzo, Sarah, Constanzo's boyfriend and bodyguard, Martin Quintana, and his other boyfriend, Omar Oria, and a Hernandez family hitman named Alvaro de Leon Valdez, better known as El Dubi, had all been spotted in Brownsville on the day the first 12 bodies were unearthed. But after that, it was as if they'd vanished into thin air. With no clear leads on where they might have fled, the police widened their search. They knew Constanzo had ties to Miami and Mexico City, so they issued a bolo to law enforcement in those areas, hoping to catch him if he returned to familiar territory. Meanwhile, the investigation pressed on. Police searched Constanzo's home and apartment in Mexico City, uncovering altars, candles, and other items used in occult rituals. Among the eerie discoveries were some of Sarah's personal belongings, which momentarily led investigators to wonder if she'd been killed. But there was no evidence of violence at either location, suggesting she was still alive and possibly on the run. And so the manhunt continued. Investigators soon discovered that the day after the graves were uncovered at the St. Elena ranch, Sarah had called Texas Southmost College, where she was a student, and said she wouldn't be coming back. She claimed she needed to handle some personal issues, but in reality, she was slipping into the shadows. When news broke identifying Sarah as the cult's godmother, her fellow students and faculty were stunned. How could it be? The bright, beautiful, hard-working girl they knew connected to such evil and violence? The disbelief was palpable. As the school's spokesman put it, quote, "We're shocked and astounded that this could go on, that a student here could be involved in something like this," end quote. At first, many people were convinced that Sarah had been framed. It just seemed impossible that she was really involved. But that illusion was shattered when police searched her bedroom at her parents' house in Matamoros. There they found an altar complete with black candles, beaded necklaces, and cigars, the very items associated with Constanzo's rituals. Nearby, a blood-spattered wall left no doubt. Sarah had been deeply involved in the cartel's dark practices. So did her parents just, not see that her wall was splattered in blood? What? Did they not go in there? I don't understand. So as the truth of Sarah's double life began to emerge, memories of her behavior started resurfacing. Things that once seemed harmless now appeared far more sinister. For example, while Sarah was the daughter of a retired electrician, she drove a brand new car with a built-in phone, a luxury in 1989, and not something you'd expect from a college student with modest means. And there was also this one night when Sarah convinced 3 male friends to watch The Believers. After the movie ended, Sarah stood up and began to preach in strange, eerie tones about the occult. At the time, her friends brushed it off. They thought she was just trying to be spooky, scare them, tell a scary story. And they'd been drinking, so she could have been fueled by that. But now, with the truth out in the open, they saw it for what it was. She hadn't been joking. The signs were always there. It's just that nobody had noticed. On April 15th, Mark Kilroy was laid to rest in his hometown of Santa Fe, Texas. Family, friends, and community members gathered to say their final goodbyes while James and Helen stood before the crowd expressing their gratitude. Despite their overwhelming sorrow, they took a moment to thank the media, law enforcement, and everyone who had supported them throughout their search for Mark. James spoke with a mixture of pride and heartache, stating, quote, "We were proud of Mark, and we thank God for the way he was and the way we were with him. But Mark's with God, so we're not worried about Mark. Don't be sad for Mark. Be sad for us and for yourselves, because Mark's not here, and the world is missing another good man," end quote. His words hung heavy in the air, a poignant reminder of a young life lost. Bishop Joseph Fiorenza addressed those gathered, acknowledging the pain and grief that had gripped the Kilroy family over the past month. He said, quote, "The last month has been a long, long nightmare for the Kilroy family. The discovery of Mark's body and the subsequent details of his savage death have only compounded the grief and the sorrow that invaded the Kilroy family and the lives of all of us. But besides pledging our solidarity in words and prayer, Jim and Helen and Keith, I want to thank you for the gift that you have given all of us. You have taught us how to face adversity of the worst type with dignity and grace and graciousness while being under intense pressure," end quote. Hear to that. So Father John DeFork also spoke, sharing how he had received calls from across the country from people inspired by the Kilroy family strength. He said, quote, "No, Mark's death has not been in vain, as our Lord's death was not in vain. God allows us to see the ugliness, the depraved, and the senseless killing so we might open our minds and hearts to become an answer to these horrible problems in the world," end quote. He then turned to the Kilroy family, offering words of solace and admiration, and said, quote, "You have reached thousands and thousands of people who needed to hear what you had to say," end quote. The words of comfort from Bishop Fiorenza and Father DeFork resonated deeply with everyone present, reminding them that while Mark's life had been tragically cut short, his legacy would live on, inspiring others to face adversity with courage, compassion, and unwavering faith. As the search for Adolfo Constanzo, Sarah Aldrate, and the remaining cult members continued, the police devised a plan to provoke Constanzo, hoping to force him into making a mistake. They brought a shaman to Rancho Santa Elena to provide a purification ritual, aiming to strip the site of its dark power. Members of the media were invited to witness the event, and a photographer from a Brownsville newspaper later recalled the shaman's actions, stating, quote, "He was going through these hand motions, gesturing, then he closed his eyes and made the sign of a cross," end quote. While the ritual was underway, officers set the shack ablaze, knowing how much it meant to Constanzo. As the flames roared, the shaman threw bags of white powder into the fire, trying to drive away the evil spirits that had lingered there. When the flames finally died down, leaving nothing but charred remains, the officers laid a wooden cross on the ashes, a symbolic end to Constanzo's reign over the ranch. The police would later learn that this act had the intended effect. When Constanzo heard about the shack's destruction, he flew into a rage, smashing lamps and overturning furniture. They'd struck a nerve, that was for sure. In early May, a tip came in that Constanzo might be hiding in the Veronica and Zora's neighborhood of Mexico City. Acting on this information, more than a dozen officers were dispatched to the area. While there, they spotted a man attempting to buy large amounts of groceries using U.S. dollars, an unusual sight that immediately raised suspicions. The officers discreetly followed the man to an apartment on Rio Sena. After days of surveillance, they identified the man buying groceries as Alduve, a known hitman for the Hernandez family, and it became clear he was buying said groceries for Constanzo and the others hiding out with him. On May 6th, the police surrounded the building, waiting for traffic to thin out before initiating the raid. Just as they were about to make their move, a vehicle pulled up in front of the complex, drawing their attention, and at that same time, Constanzo noticed them from his window, and that's when he snapped. What followed was utter chaos. Constanzo grabbed a machine gun and began firing at the police, triggering a wild shootout. Incredibly, the only person wounded was a police officer hit by Constanzo's initial shots. I wonder if, he was a Paulo Mayambe follower as well. And he had been protected from bullets. So inside the apartment, Constanzo then went on a rampage, for some reason burning around $3,000 in cash on the stove and throwing gold coins and money out of the window in a desperate, frenzied attempt to do who knows what. I don't know. Maybe he was trying to draw people there so it would bring crowds and the police wouldn't be able to do what they were going to do. I don't know. But after about an hour of gunfire and frantic behavior, Constanzo came to a grim realization. His capture was inevitable. Refusing to be taken alive, he turned to Alduve and gave his final order. He needed Alduve to kill him and Martin. Alduve hesitated, but Constanzo struck him, warning that failing to follow through would mean torment in hell. So Alduve agreed, and Constanzo sat on a stool inside a closet, pulling Martin close beside him. With one final nod, Constanzo gave the signal, and Alduve squeezed the trigger of his machine gun. The bullets tore through Constanzo and Martin, ending their lives in a hell of gunfire. With Constanzo and Martin dead, Alduve turned the gun towards the window, firing at the police until he ran out of ammunition. In the aftermath, Sarah Aldrete burst from the apartment, hands raised, shouting, "He's dead! They killed him, he's dead!" The police moved in, arresting Sarah, Alduve, and Omar. Shortly afterwards, two women named Maria, who had rented the apartment for Constanzo, were also taken into custody. When the police searched the apartment, they discovered evidence of Constanzo's rituals: an altar, black candles, 2 swords, a skull made of white wax, black tunics, and a blindfolded doll clutching another smaller doll. Constanzo and Martin's lifeless bodies were found slumped together in the small closet, riddled with bullet wounds. But even in death, Constanzo's influence lingered. Worried that he might have somehow faked his demise, the police took extra precautions. The bodies were sent for autopsy and fingerprinting, and only then was it confirmed. One of the bodies was indeed Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo. The following day, Sarah, Alduve, Omar, and the 2 Marias were taken to the Attorney General's office and presented before the media for questioning. They stood behind a table covered with confiscated cult items from the apartment, a stark reminder of the dark rituals they'd been a part of. Facing the cameras, Sarah recounted how she became involved in Constanzo's religion. When asked if she had loved him, she replied, quote, "I did not love him, but I followed him," end quote. She did deny any involvement in the cult's murders, claiming she hadn't known about them until she saw the victims' bodies on television. She said, quote, "When I saw the things on the television, watching all the sacrifices and all of that, it was amazing," end quote. Amazing, like in a good way or a bad way. And if you saw that, why did you stay with him? Why did you run away with him? Sarah then added, quote, "I feel sorry because when Mark disappeared, I was trying to help the Kilroy family," end quote. She didn't elaborate on what she meant by trying to help, quickly adding, "If I had known the cult was like this, I wouldn't have been in it," end quote. Bullshit. Sarah went on to describe how Constanzo's personality had an overpowering effect on her, stating, quote, "If he tells you to do something right now, if he orders you, you will do it. I don't even know why, but you will do it," end quote. Yeah, because he's so powerful. Okay, so powerful. He's just another Charles Manson. But the police weren't convinced, right? Because based on their investigation, they believed Sarah had played a direct role in the gruesome sacrifice of at least one person, her ex-boyfriend, Gilberto Sosa. According to reports, Sarah had lured Sosa to the ranch and had even overseen his slow and brutal death, a death that involved cutting off his nipples with scissors and boiling him alive. Her involvement, they concluded, wasn't just passive. She was an active participant in the cult's most twisted rituals. I mean, she was Constanzo's second in command, she was the godmother. Why wouldn't she be a part of the sacrifices and the death? So while Sarah continued to deny her role in the cult's heinous acts, Aldoubet was far more forthcoming. He openly admitted that he and other cult members knew about the human sacrifices and had even participated in them. He described sitting around a table, watching as Constanzo mutilated his victims. Aldoubet recounted how he had even been marked for divine protection during a ceremony in Mexico City in January after killing someone in Matamoros. To prove his role, he pulled back his shirt, revealing arrow designs branded into the skin of his upper arms, a haunting symbol of his initiation. When asked specifically about Mark Kilroy's death, Aldoubet didn't hold back. He confessed to being involved. But when it came to who had actually delivered the fatal blows, he didn't hesitate to say it had been the Godfather himself. Aldoubet revealed that after the arrest of Seraphin, Elio, and the others, but before the bodies were discovered, the remaining cult members fled to a hotel in Brownsville. When the first victims' bodies were unearthed, they immediately flew to Mexico City, desperate to stay one step ahead of the authorities. As the days passed, Constanzo became increasingly erratic. When he learned that the police had burned down his beloved shack, he lost it completely. His desperation grew more palpable with every passing moment. Both Sarah and Aldoubet recounted the final hours before their capture, and the picture they painted was one of absolute and pure chaos. Aldoubet shared the chilling details of the moment Constanzo ordered him to kill himself and Martin, and at first he refused, but Constanzo struck him, and he was like, hey, if you don't follow through, you're going to suffer eternal torment. So Aldoubet said, quote, I killed Adolfo and Martin with a machine gun after Constanzo asked me to. I didn't want to do it, but Adolfo told me that things would be bad for you in hell. They entered the closet, I squeezed the trigger, end quote. So at least these people know, like, if they're going anywhere, they're going to hell. But to tell someone like things are going to be bad for you in hell, aren't things bad for everyone in hell? I don't know. Maybe not for demonic people. Maybe that's just like them going home. I'm not sure. So anyways, the next day, Sarah and Aldoubet were presented at yet another press conference. And this time, Aldoubet publicly declared that Sarah had not been involved in the killings. And Sarah took the opportunity to describe how she had become a willing student of what Constanzo called Christian Santeria. She explained, quote, it was like curiosity. He was a very charismatic person. He was very mystical. I wanted to find out why he was like that, end quote. Despite her repeated denials, Sarah's involvement in the ritual killings was questioned again. She stated, quote, I have never in my life participated in human sacrifice. I don't know how I got into this without knowing what it was, end quote. 'Cause you didn't. You knew what it was. Sarah recounted how, after Elio, Seraphin, and the others were arrested, she and the remaining cult members fled to Brownsville. However, she didn't know why at the time. She recalled, quote, living in Brownsville, it was like hell. They treated me like a prisoner. I was scared, end quote. She failed to explain how the group had prevented her from escaping or contacting authorities, leaving many skeptical of her claims, including me. I am one of the many. So Sarah went on to describe learning about the murders while watching television with Adolfo Constanzo. She remembered him turning to her and saying, they found the bodies, we have to leave. And she says she asked him, what do you mean? And he responded, okay, you want to know? I'll tell you. It was then that he revealed the full extent of his crimes, how he had done it, and why. Allegedly. Okay, Sarah. In the days that followed, the group fled to Mexico City, moving between small towns near the capital as they tried to evade capture. A few weeks before their arrest, they settled into the apartment where the police finally closed in on them. Following these press conferences, all the cult members who were captured faced the consequences of their actions. They were indicted on multiple charges, including weapons and narcotics violations, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 13 counts of murder for the ritual slayings that had shocked the world. On May 20th, the 4 arrested gang members, Seraphin, Elio, Sergio, and David, who had initially confessed to the murders and led police to the bodies, made a shocking claim. They now alleged that Mexican police had tortured them into signing confessions. According to the men, they were shocked with cattle prods, beaten, and had plastic bags placed over their heads until they lost consciousness. The police, of course, denied these allegations. But even if the accusations were true, no one seemed to care. Once again, including me, okay? You tortured that poor boy. You tortured Mark Kilroy and countless others, and we're supposed to feel bad for you that you had a bag put over your head and some hot sauce sprayed up your nose? I don't, okay? I don't feel bad for you people at all. In the eyes of myself and many, these were dangerous criminals who were simply getting what they deserved. They were getting their karma. As the years went by, the members of Constanzo's cult faced multiple trials, each one peeling back another layer of their dark history. Aldoubet was convicted of killing Constanzo and Martin, receiving a 35-year prison sentence. Sarah Aldrate was charged with the same murders, but was ultimately acquitted of those charges. Instead, she was convicted of criminal association and sentenced to just 6 years in prison. But their legal battles were far from over. In a separate trial, Sarah, Elio, Serafin, Aldubi, and other cult members were convicted of the 13 ritual slayings that took place at the Santa Elena Ranch. This time, Sarah was sentenced to 62 years, while the men received 67-year prison terms. In 1998, however, after an appeal by the cult members, a judge ruled that the sentences handed down in 1994 exceeded the maximum allowed by Mexican law, and the terms were reduced to 50 years each, which was the legal maximum at the time, which is like, this is getting ridiculous. Ridiculous. What's the difference between 50 and 62 when you killed a bunch of people? But anyways, even with Adolfo de Jesus Constanza dead and his followers now serving what was essentially life in prison, although not life in prison, the fear didn't fade. People wondered whether another cult leader might rise to take his place, which is a valid concern. When Sarah was asked her thoughts on this from prison, her answer wasn't reassuring. She said, quote, "I don't think the religion will end with us because it has a lot of people in it. It will continue." End quote. And her words hinted at an unsettling legacy that refused to be buried with Constanzo. In 2003, Sarah spoke to the media once again, still denying any involvement in Mark Kilroy's murder or the other cult killings. She argued that it was impossible for investigators to fully understand what had happened at the Santa Elena Ranch, because the one person who knew the most, Constanzo, was dead. Sarah even suggested that the police had concealed the involvement of famous individuals associated with Constanzo for their own convenience. She concluded by declaring that she believed in God and wouldn't ask society for forgiveness, standing firm in her claim of innocence. The following year, Sarah gave another interview, this time sharing graphic details about the torture she claimed to have endured at the hands of the police. Convenient that it took years for you to talk about that, but she recounted how she'd been stripped, blindfolded, hung upside down, beaten, and even had her toenails yanked out. According to Sarah, she was burned so severely, both inside and out, that a doctor told her she'd never be able to have children, even if she were released. Perhaps the most harrowing detail was when she described how police officers had allegedly forced her hands into Constanzo's autopsied body at the morgue, demanding that she pull out his heart. She claimed they screamed at her, "There is your devil, there is your prince, kiss him, kiss him." Eventually, Sarah published an autobiography offering her version of events. However, this time she claimed that neither she nor the rest of the cult members knew about the killings in Matamoros until they learned that the police were searching for them, which we already know isn't true because Aldubi was like, yeah, we all knew about it, we all took part in it, etc. So she questioned the police's decision to burn down the shack at the ranch, suggesting that it likely held crucial evidence, such as fingerprints of the real murderers, evidence that could have been vital to the investigation. And she's not really wrong there. Like, they could have taken that machete. They probably still have the machete, right? But they could have taken that. They could have fingerprinted it. I'm not sure if that's what they did. At the end of the day, though, you were part of a cult and you were part of a belief system that did this to people. So you're wrong. You're still wrong, and you still deserve to face justice for that. Sarah claimed that she and the cult members went into hiding out of fear for their lives, not because they were involved in any murders. She insisted that Constanzo had taken her hostage, refusing to let her go, convinced she'd turn them over to the authorities if given the chance. Her account of Constanzo's death also contradicted the official version. According to Sarah, Constanzo wasn't killed on his own orders by Aldubi, but he was executed by the police during the raid on the apartment, which is easy to disprove. So despite Sarah's new version of events and the ongoing questions surrounding the cult's actions, the focus was beginning to shift away from the criminals and towards something far more meaningful. While Sergio, Serafin, Elio, Sarah, Aldubi, and others now sat behind bars, Mark Kilroy's parents, James and Helen, were focused on something far more profound, turning their devastating loss into a force for good. They wrote a book and founded the Mark Kilroy Foundation with a mission to provide drug education, information, and prevention. Determined to make sure other families didn't experience the same heartbreak, the Kilroys took their message across the country, speaking out about the dangers of substance abuse and the importance of awareness. At one point, they traveled to Washington, D.C., where they met with National Drug Policy Director William J. Bennett and President George H.W. Bush at the White House. The administration was preparing its first comprehensive strategy for combating drugs and drug trafficking, and they sought advice from citizens who'd been directly impacted by the crisis. Speaking about the Kilroys, Bennett later said, quote, "The nation suffered with the Kilroys, but since that time of the loss of their son Mark, the Kilroys have taken their pain and their tragedy and turned it into a very good effort," end quote. After the meeting, Helen expressed hope for the future. She believed the government would do its part, but emphasized, quote, "But all of us are going to have to do our part too. It's going to take the entire nation, with everyone doing their part, to rid our country of this terrible scourge, end quote. The Mark Kilroy Foundation continued to grow, eventually sponsoring the SAFE program, Substance Abuse Free Environment, a community-based initiative for youth and families. The foundation partnered with the city of Santa Fe, local school districts, businesses, and private donors to provide year-round programs designed to keep young people engaged, active, and away from the dangers of drugs. During each summer, the foundation, its partners, and countless volunteers hosted camps and offered a variety of sports like archery, golfing, fishing, tennis, and swimming, all completely free. James explained their mission, stating, quote, "We want to promote that they have things they can do in the summertime instead of sitting around with their friends bored and thinking about doing drugs," end quote. Through their unwavering dedication, the Kilroys transformed their unimaginable grief and loss into a beacon of hope, reaching countless families and communities. They ensured that Mark's legacy would be one of education, empowerment, and positive change, turning a tragedy into a powerful message for, hopefully, a better future. Meanwhile, the cult members continued to maintain their innocence. In a 2014 interview with the press, Serafin Hernandez Garcia and Sergio Martinez Salinas shared their side of the story, insisting on their innocence and alleging a massive cover-up by law enforcement. Serafin began by claiming that the police had assumed his guilt simply because of his family ties to Elio Hernandez. According to Serafin, he'd never even met Adolfo Constanzo and was completely unaware that his family's ranch had become a gathering place for the cult's dark rituals. It's so convenient, Serafin. You're the one that confessed and led the police to the graves, dude. You brought them to the grave. You brought them to the graves. He went further, accusing the police of fabricating the narrative that had been fed to the media. Contrary to the official reports, Serafin claimed he wasn't arrested at the ranch, but at his family's home. He insisted that he was then tortured by both Mexican and U.S. police officers in Matamoros, coerced into falsely confessing his involvement in Mark Kilroy's murder and the ritual killings at Santa Elena. He also disputed the story that he had personally dug up 12 bodies at the ranch, stating he was brought there only after the remains had already been exhumed. Sergio's account actually mirrored Serafin's. He explained that although he lived near the ranch and worked as a driver for the Hernandez family, he had no knowledge of the horrors taking place on the property. He admitted to seeing Constanzo at the ranch with the Hernandez family on occasion, but claimed they'd never spoken. According to Sergio, he was never part of the cult and had never heard anyone mention it. Dude, you earlier admitted that you had helped kidnap them and bury them. Sergio also recounted his arrest, asserting that, like Serafin, he wasn't taken into custody at the ranch, but at Serafin's family house. He claimed that he was beaten and forced to confess to crimes he hadn't committed. According to him, the police then took him to the ranch, making him pose alongside the exhumed bodies to further the narrative that he'd been involved in the grisly murders. So while the stories of those connected to the cult continue to evolve and change, the Kilroy family faced yet another tragedy. On December 22, 2014, Helen Kilroy, Mark's mother, passed away after a long battle with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. She was 70 years old and had been married to James Kilroy for 47 years, a lifetime filled with memories, joy, and heartache. James is still alive today, though age has made him less visible in the public eye. As time has passed, it's now Mark's friends who often speak to the media, keeping his memory alive. In March 2024, 35 years after Mark was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, his childhood friend Ryan Fenley, who had originally planned to join Mark on that fateful spring break trip, but canceled at the last minute, took a moment to reflect on the tragedy and offer advice to others. He emphasized the importance of safety, regardless of where you're traveling, stating, quote, "If you're going to go into those areas, you better stay in groups. Do not get separated whatsoever, not even for 1 minute. Do not walk over there carrying lots and lots of cash. Do not carry lots of jewelry. Fine clothes will bring attention to yourselves. Know your surroundings. Don't stick your face in that phone. Know your environment. Be alert. Because if your head's down and you're not paying attention, you can be a prime target," end quote. This is excellent advice, and I suggest everybody listen to it. But Ryan also speaks about the pain of wondering who Mark would have become if his life hadn't been so brutally cut short. He said, quote, "Mark today would have been a medical doctor. He would have been 56 years old. He would have been done with UT, with med school. He would have a family," end quote. But all of those dreams, all of those possibilities were snatched away by a group of drug dealers who believed that sacrificing Mark would somehow protect them from the law. In the end, though, Mark's death didn't shield them from justice. It actually only ensured that the police came knocking on their door. And if not for Mark Kilroy, who knows how long it would have taken to find out who these people were, to find out what they were doing, and to get them off the streets. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for being here with me for these Harloween videos. Let me know what you think about Mark Kilroy and the case. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, and subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay spooky. And I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say I have Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood on